Hello, and welcome to the live series Straight Off the Bat. Join us on Thursdays as we speak to individuals from multiple industries who will help you understand financial literacy and education. If you're joining us from Facebook, thank you so much. Don't forget to like and follow our page to stay updated with content that helps you manage your money. I'm your host, Pauline Joseph, and today we're discussing International Women's Day Breaking Ground. This International Women's Day, Straight Off the Bat, shines a spotlight on the construction industry through the lens of Patries Ramkaran. She's the founder and managing director of Ramkaran Contracting Services Limited. From navigating a male dominated field to establishing her voice and credibility, Patrice shares her journey of resilience, sacrifice, and growth. Under the theme Give to Gain, this conversation explores what it truly takes to rise, what you must give, what you gain, and how support systems like the Contractors Association play a critical role in advancing women in non traditional sectors. Whether you're an aspiring entrepreneur, a professional, or simply looking for inspiration, this episode will challenge, empower, and remind you that growth often begins where comfort ends. Let's welcome Patries Ramkaran. How are you today?
Good morning, Pauline, and good morning to the viewing audience. I'm doing fine, thank you, and thanks for having me.
Well, let's just get straight into it because a lot of people think an hour is a long time, but truly there's so much to cover. So, Patrice, take us back to the beginning. Breaking ground is part of challenging norms. What did breaking ground look like for you as a woman entering the construction industry?
Well, breaking ground for me didn't start on a construction site. It started when I was about 13 years old, trying to figure out what I wanted to become. At first, I wanted to be a model, and my mom said no. And then I thought of becoming a surgeon. And after doing my research, I've realized that path wasn't a realistic one for me financially. Being the eldest of six children, financially, my parents couldn't afford to fund that education. And everything changed when I entered secondary school. I attended the Cohen Hamilton Secondary School, and I took on technical drawing as a subject. And there it is, I got the first exposure for the construction industry in terms of designing, drawing, house plans, etc. And at that point, I decided I wanted to become a civil engineer. But however, professionally, I would have pursued project management. And from secondary school, I pursued my diploma in civil engineering at the San Fernando Technical Institute. And there's where my parents would have indicated to me they could only fund a diploma. After that diploma was completed, I got a job at Patries at the time as an administrative assistant. And the life was a grind because I had to commute from New Grand to Guayaguari, which is approximately 2 hours without traffic. And then from Guayaguari to San Fernando, where I pursued my higher national diploma in civil engineering. However, at that time, my desire was to build a career at that company, but things changed where I moved from a contract employee to a temporary employee. And then I decided I wanted to work for my own self. I wanted to create my own opportunities. And 2005 is where I decided to incorporate the company Ramkaran Contracting Services Limited. The real breaking ground, I would say, was with the first project. You thought you have a project from the government, you could go to the bank for 100, some sort of financing. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. I had to lean on my own savings, loans from friends and families so that I could finance this project. Because as we all know, in the public sector, payments is usually a longer period in terms of being issued. And at that particular project, which was the Shell Recreational Ground in Rio Claro, I had reached the final stage at that job, which was to pave the jogging track using asphalt. And the supplier who I rented the steamroller from pulled the roller off the site, and I was left with tons of asphalt with no equipment, the proper equipment to lay that, because the asphalt reached late, and more or less he decided he's not going to wait longer to get this done. So there I had a choice to panic, a choice to adapt. So what I did was improvise, more or less to use the other roller on site just to seal the base course of the track, and more afterwards we would have come in and apply a final coat of asphalt. But the client rejected that. And I would say that moment where I broke ground was a baptism of fire, where I had that experience in terms of how I entered into the construction industry. So that is how I broke ground, getting the first project, and then more or less it wasn't as planned. And after that occurred, I decided, you know what, let me go get a job. I worked for a few organizations and I wasn't feeling fulfilled in terms of my roles. And I decided, and in addition to that, I remember our commutes from New Grand to Port of Spain. You leave in the dark, you reach home in the dark. And at that time, I had a young daughter who would have hardly seen me based on the nature of the work. And then at that point, I decided to embark full time into the business. And that's how I would say I break down ground in terms of entering the construction industry.
Well, congratulations on pushing through the challenges and kept it going. As the infamous Pixar movie says, just keep swimming. So when it comes to this industry, because it's definitely that's fair to say it's male dominated. Was there any particular inspiration for you as to why you entered the construction industry?
My inspiration in terms of why I entered the construction industry, basically I would say is passion. I always like the idea. As I said, my first exposure was at secondary school, being able to draw a house plan and being able to see that construct into reality. That was my motivating factor. Seeing a dream or seeing a plan turn into an actual as-built project. So that was my inspiration, why I entered into this industry.
Wow, and you get to see things from start to finish. That must be an amazing feeling.
Yes, it is.
So when it comes to this space, I mean, you can let me know if I'm wrong by saying it's male dominated. But could you go back to, you mentioned the story with the asphalt, maybe another earlier challenge that you faced stepping into this construction industry? Because you did mention your mom was like, no, when you first presented certain ideas. But can you give us like one other challenge that you face stepping into the construction space, especially with the male domination that it is?
Okay, sure. Well, walking into construction as a woman, I learned quickly, generally, some of the challenges are not always visible. Sometimes it's deliberate, sometimes it's subtle. Earlier, I mentioned the situation regarding the rental of the steamroller. And I found out that the same person I rented this equipment from also had bid for this job. And looking back at it, I truly believe was sabotage because in the industry, you understand the impact of those decisions. And you don't make it lightly for fellow contractors or fellow professionals operating in the industry. So I would say definitely sabotage. And in addition to that, there was stereotyping. I remember showing up for meetings and people would assume that I am representing Mr. Ramkaran if Mr. Ramkaran is coming to join the meeting. And I would calmly say, look at me, look at her, I am Miss Ramkaran. But those moments didn't really break me, it sharpened me, it taught me something sometimes that challenges is not always the norm. And those were the two main challenges I would face. And in addition to that, it's financing from financial institutions. I would have mentioned earlier, you think you have a contract, you could go to the bank to get funding, but most times they required 100% security. So those were the three challenges I faced: financing, stereotype, as well as a bit of sabotage in the beginning.
Wow, that sounds like a lot. And there's this perception of entrepreneurship being glamorous, and most people don't know it is the least glamorous thing ever.
It is at times.
Yeah, well, yeah. It's like, oh, I'm going to work for myself, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a success. But we're focusing on you, and we're defining some of those moments where, you mentioned folks looking past you in terms of who runs the company and looking for someone else. But within this theme of International Women's Day, as we close off this month, where maybe there was a situation where you had to prove yourself or push past your own self-doubt in this space in the construction industry. Can you share that story with us?
Sure. It's interesting for me now that after 20 years in business, I found myself in a season where it is it feels like starting over again. And last year, as I said, we celebrated 20 years as an organization, but it felt like starting over. And why it felt like starting over is that we faced severe delay payments from clients. And for the first time in all the years of business operating, we we had some issues in meeting our commitments. Every week you're hoping, okay, that the client would pay, etc. And at that point in time, thoughts creep in. Is this worth it? Should I walk away? Because more or less you build assets which you could liquidate and live a life that's comfortable without running an organization. And at that point I had that self-doubt, because even during the pandemic, we survived uncertainty, and we would have changed the model of the business in terms of changing the services we provide and adding on additional services. But due to the pandemic, we survived that uncertainty and had to push back in terms of the change of that model. And even now it feels a bit overwhelmed, because there's a war in Iran. There's a high possibility that there would be an increase in construction material. Our economy is a bit unstable. And I mean, there's this doubt in terms of you operating in the industry and you're not sure in terms of the direction. But what I do when I'm faced with that, especially now, that sense of feeling overwhelmed, that sense of feeling sold out, I would just take time, travel, reset, come back with a strategy for us to go through this, because as an SME, we went through the pandemic. I started the organization with inexperience, and we made 20 years, and more or less is building resilience and perseverance, and not allowing the doubt to make our strategic decision. We may be delayed in terms of when we want to get it done, but it's keeping forward, as I mentioned earlier, having the vision, the perseverance to pursue.
And I feel like that's great advice, regardless of if you're in entrepreneurship or not. What you mentioned about taking a step back, that may mean for you jumping on a plane. For others, that may mean a sport, just to get your mind away from things, because when you're in it, it feels like a hurricane, right? So when it comes to your approach, which as I mentioned earlier, it's something we all should look at when we feel this sense of being overwhelmed. What mindset or values help you stay the course when these things are happening? And I don't think it ever changes. This idea of, well, back in my day it used to be better. There's always something happening. There's always something in terms of challenges and shifts. So share some insight as an entrepreneur with this 20 years in business. What should we look for in terms of that mindset and value?
With regards to mindsets and values, three things which took me through and even up to now is the vision in terms of where you are, where you want to go. Sometimes the journey mightn't be as planned out, but the end goal definitely is what we're working towards. That vision of your organization, that vision you have for your life, whatever your vision is, you have that vision in terms of having that success mindset, for one, that this would be successful. You have the belief in yourself to know that you could persevere this, belief in your staff, belief in knowing that you could fulfill this mandate that you are carrying forward. And I think the most important value, or the most important mindset in this case for me, is definitely perseverance, because they could have the vision, they could have the belief, they could have whatever it needs, but sometimes you need to pursue for continuity. And I believe strongly in purpose. Business is not just about money. Yes, there's monetary benefits, but purpose. What difference are you making to impact the community you are in, and by extension, the country, extension by the world? And that is what more or less we build in. Sometimes when we are closest to that turning point of growth, that is when you want to give up. And more or less, as I said earlier, we need to persevere in order to be successful and to achieve that vision you want to carry forward with.
Fantastic advice, Patrice. I think we are all going to take away something from this, regardless of if you're an entrepreneur or not. These are, tidbits that we all need to hear. So we want to talk about failure, but we're going to do so right after the break, Patrice, because I want you to think about it and be an inspiration for the folks who are watching this. When we come back, we're going to look at failure and how Patrice looked at overcoming a setback. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Straight Off the Bat, a show that helps you understand financial literacy and education. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you're doing so from YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to our page to continue seeing content that'll help you manage your money. Today, we're covering the topic International Women's Day Breaking Ground. I'm your host, Pauline Joseph, and we're joined by Patries Ramkaran. She is the visionary founder and managing director of Ramkaran Contracting Services Limited, a role she has held since establishing the company in 2005. Wow, I'm still connecting the dots with saying 2026. With over 2 decades of experience in the construction industry, she has built a reputation for strategic leadership, technical excellence, and a commitment to delivering high impact projects. So let's welcome back Patries. Thanks again for joining us today. So just before the break, we were discussing, failure, which is, let's be honest, no one wants to talk about it. No one wants to experience it, but it's a reality, not just in life, but absolutely in entrepreneurship. So can you share a moment where a failure or a setback that you had?
Well, as I shared earlier, my first project, that Breaking Ground project, definitely it felt as failure. I mean, we did hand over the project successfully to the client. However, their claims at the time was the asphalt didn't burn to the subbase. And while we removed them, we had the necessary evidence that their claim wasn't true. But as I said earlier, in that situation, I didn't have the experience at the time, to go through the technicality and the legality of the contracts in terms of overturning that, fear of this is your first project, you don't want to do anything to make the client feel that you are overriding their decisions. But that would have been my first experience of failure. And what it taught me more or less is perseverance. I mean, since that stage now, I do not do any sort of roadworks or asphalt works after that project. I deliberately refrain from it, and because of what happened. However, that would have been one aspect of failure. In terms of growth, sometimes I feel as if the procurement process is not fair, in the sense that you bid for jobs, sometimes you don't get it for whatever reason the case is. But thankfully, in 2023, the Procurement Legislation Act has been proclaimed, so it makes it a lot fairer for all competitors bidding. But what I did I saw that as a setback, because our model was we bid for jobs, we get government, public sector projects. And more or less what I did, I decided to pivot and change the direction of the organization, as I mentioned before. So for example, in 2027, we expanded in providing janitorial services, which definitely changed the growth path and expand the services we provide. And more or less in the last few years or so, our focus is more or less on building sustainable communities, not just completing projects, renovation projects, etc., but building communities for Trinidad and the wider Caribbean. So that is our vision in terms of the growth, which this setback in terms of interference in the procurement process, we decided to expand our services.
So what I found interesting in what you said earlier about the setback that happened with the asphalt, and there's a lot of terminologies a lot of us may not understand, because as with every industry, there are words and stuff that we're all like, what does that mean? But when it comes to that particular incident, would you say that allowed you to realize that that's not the space you want to be in, and you pivot to something specific? Because you said you no longer do those road projects.
Yeah. So definitely, based on what I've experienced with it, I decided I am not going to tender for any roadworks project. And hence the reason I mean, the reality is probably we may do it in the future, but that's for me, based on what happened, I just decided to refrain from it.
And as you're speaking and you said the word pivot, I'm just automatically thinking about that friend scene where it's like pivot, pivot. It's so important for us to actually be able to say, okay, this is not something that's in my space. Let me go to the next step, which obviously you've proven because I mean you're here 20 years later. So when it comes to building that confidence and credibility when you get into the rooms, where you may have been underestimated, how would you say you've built that ability to now say, yes, I belong here?
I strongly believe, and it's my opinion, that confidence then doesn't come from titles. You could have a title, I'm the managing director for Ramkaran, but I believe confidence comes with competence, knowing exactly the space you operate with. Like, for example, in my situation, in my case, I know the construction industry. I understand the dynamics between a SME and a large corporation. And most importantly, building confidence has to come from competence. You have to know what you are doing. Your actions and words must follow some level of competence so that you not just confidence within you, but confidence with other stakeholders and people that you are involved with. And I believe in showing up prepared and also building your credibility, not just what you achieve, but more or less how it is enabled, more or less. So definitely building confidence, in my opinion, is definitely having the competence for what you are doing and doing it well, so that you could be trusted.
Completely agree. You have way more confidence when you've actually gone through the thing that you're discussing. So it allows you to be like, hey, I've done this before. I can speak with authority on this particular subject because I've been here. And we want to shout out Wendy. She's joining us from Facebook, Perseverance. Yes, good nuggets from Patries Ramkaran. Thanks a lot for joining us today. So we're going to look at this conversation because we're celebrating women in this month of March and looking at International Women's Day. What would you say in your journey were barriers that you have to break through within that space as a woman, and how has that shaped the path for other women coming behind you?
So, 10 years ago, I would have developed my driving force being why I exist, what I do. And my driving force, ironically, integrates or ties back into this question, which is breaking barriers so others could learn through my experience. And two major barriers I would say I would have faced, as I mentioned earlier, is access to financing from financial institutions. And the other one is representation in the decision-making spaces. Over time, I've realized the journey that I pursue is not just all about me, but making way for others behind me, not just females, but also males and anybody that may want to enter the industry or look at business or entrepreneurship on the whole. And I think it's important for us to make the path clear for those who come in behind us. And that is important, more or less, because they can learn from your mistakes, definitely, learn from your wins. And I think most importantly, for someone else, they don't have to start from zero. I remember when I started 20 years ago, there wasn't any conversation about entrepreneurship. There wasn't conversation as it relates to business, young people getting in business. The typical example you see, you educate yourself, you get a decent job, and you pursue a career there. But thankfully now, those, myself and even those within these spaces, there are conversation ideas. Like, for example, you all are hosting Bankers Association, highlighting the journeys of entrepreneurs in this segment. That definitely makes it easier for those who come behind through the process of mentorship, conversation, and learning, as I mentioned before, from our experiences, so they do not have to repeat the mistakes that we make.
Yeah, it's so important for us to turn back, right? Mentorship. And this theme of give to gain, how do you see that coinciding with the ideology behind mentorship?
The team gift the game and how it coincides with the ideology with mentorship. Definitely, I think we have to look at the given aspect, paying it forward. How are we going to pay it forward in our space? And most people may think, or some may believe, that we have to create big events or outrageous stuff. Sometimes that's for whatever personal gains it is. But I definitely believe it's important for us to pay it forward. And we could pay it forward in the sense and in the form of mentorship, whatever spaces. This event here is even, I would say, a form of mentorship for aspiring entrepreneurs, those within the journey, etc. And I think the question we always have to ask ourselves is, how can I make someone else's journey be easier, because I was here already? And I strongly believe also that success is not just what you build, but also what you leave behind for others to follow, for others to learn, etc.
Great advice. And I actually was going to follow up with something, but I see that Anjani Singh from LinkedIn kind of followed up on what I was going to ask you. Did you have mentors who guided you? Or will you say it was more 90% shared determination or self-motivation? Thanks for that question, Anjani.
So as I mentioned earlier, my first 10 years in business, I had to figure it out on myself, on my own, basically, how to register, how to set up and learn the system. But I had a strong technical background because of my education in civil engineering, project management, etc. So technically, yes, I was good at that. But in terms of business development operation was totally new for me. But I did pursue my MBA in entrepreneurial management, which helped. However, 10 years ago, I was selected to be part of Vital Voices, which is an NGO with the objective of empowering women internationally to be part of their VV Grow program. And at that stage, it was a turning point for me, where they would have looked out at our business, they would have evaluated, as well as provided mentorship. And that was my first experience to mentorship. And I would always say to myself, if I had that exposure earlier, definitely we would have been at a further space. But I believe strongly mentorship is definitely important. And it doesn't have to take something very formal. Mentorship might simply mean going to the beach or going to a picnic or having breakfast together with somebody that have walked the journey before. You reach out to them and have a discussion. This is my challenge. This is how I'm facing with, and they could provide the advice, etc. So to answer the question, the first decade, I didn't have that mentorship support, but the second decade, I would have been part of the Vital Voices networks, and I would have also hired a coach to provide some advice in terms of business development, etc. And I also believe in paying for, and I also believe it's important to invest in yourself also.
Yes, all great points for us to take away today, Patrice. I think it's definitely super important for all of us to invest in ourselves, because we we know what we know, but we also don't know what we don't know. So how are you going to know unless someone guides you along the way? So we're going to continue the conversation around giving, give to gain, as we cover International Women's Day in March. So when we come back from the break, we're going to expand a little bit on what it means to give, and we want to get feedback from Patrice. We'll be right back.
Tired of feeling lost when it comes to your money? Want to make your money work more for you? Then tune in to Straight Off the Bat, brought to you by the Bankers Association of Trinidad and Tobago. Every Monday at 8:30 p.m. on TV6, right after the news. We'll give you practical tools and strategies to help you manage your money wisely, from budgeting basics, debt management, to wealth creation. We'll cover it all. No jargon, just straight talk. Join our host, Pauline Joseph, as she speaks to experts across the industry to empower you to take control of your money. Straight Off the Bat, Mondays at 8:30 p.m. on TV6. Brought to you by the Bankers Association of Trinidad and Tobago.
And welcome back to Straight Off the Bat, a show that helps you understand financial literacy and education. If you're joining us from LinkedIn, don't forget to like and follow our page to stay updated with content that helps you manage your money. I'm your host, Pauline Joseph, and today we're discussing International Women's Day Breaking Ground. We're joined by Patries Ramkaran. She's the founder and managing director of Ramkaran Contracting Services Limited. She's navigated a male-dominated field to establishing her voice and credibility. Patries shares her journey of resilience, sacrifice, and growth under the theme Give to Gain. So we're going to bring back Patries into the conversation. If you missed any of whatever we discussed earlier, because this show is 60 minutes, when this live has ended across social media, you can rewatch it and replay it on social media. So just before the break, we were discussing about investing in yourself as well as mentorship. So when it comes to the theme that we're discussing today in this show, we're talking about Give to Gain, which is, let's kind of elaborate on what it means to give when it comes to your time, comfort, opportunities. What does that look like for you today? Because you did mention earlier that could mean something as simple as jumping in a car and going to the beach and having a conversation. So just share some more insight for individuals who may not understand what it means or how important it is to ask for help.
It's important to ask for help, and most importantly, I would say it's important to take action items, take action for the help you ask for. Sometimes you go to different events where different NGOs or organizations would host events. We get the nuggets in terms of this is what you have to do. But persons who ask for help, my advice is that you have a responsibility to implement the advice you get, so that in addition to that, and also paid forward. In my case, I would have gotten mentorship, as I said, from the Vital Voices organization some time ago. And I continue to pay it forward. For example, I host a Home for Me event, which is to educate persons about the home ownership process. And definitely, you give up your time to different organizations volunteering in that space. So it's okay to ask. My suggestion would be look for someone who more or less you would want to be like or do the things that they are doing. Maybe you can reach out to them on social media, send an email, etc. That may not be successful at first, However, there are different events that is being held in the country. For example, there's Women's International Day events. All these events happen where it is you could go in, hear the conversation, etc., and see. And then, there are some organizations, I know, for example, AFET and HERMAT, they offer mentorship. So, it's important that you keep abreast in terms of what is happening. And online, if you search online, there are international network as well, where you can use to probably register for mentorship. For example, there's the Sherry Bear Foundation as well out of the UK, which I was also a fellow of. They offer mentorship as well. But there's a process. So when you're asking for help, my advice is that make sure there's an implementation aspect of it so that it's beneficial to you. And when you succeed, also pay it forward by giving back as well.
Very interesting, because there seems to be quite a focus on implementation. Could you expand a little bit on that? Because for a lot of people, that may mean different things, right? So it could be, hey, I just want to hear back what I'm already thinking. I may not want to be challenged, versus this is something that someone's telling you need to change. And obviously there's a difficulty with that. So give us a little insight on what you are speaking about when it comes to implementation.
But earlier, before, I'd mentioned in terms of the 3 pillars that I'm guided by, which is the vision, your belief, and your perseverance. Whatever you want to embark on, you have to know what your end goal is. And it must be time-bound. It must be, okay, let's say, for example, I want to pursue a degree or a master's in whatever field you want to enter in. When do you want to start that? There's baby steps you have to take before you achieve the end goal. And sometimes within the journey, some persons don't want to persevere and go through the process. So for example, they want to study. What's the first thing I need to do? See what university or school is offering the program, what it's going to cost you, etc. And then they decide if you'll enroll, but you have to put some timelines towards it. And most importantly, you have to determine what is your driving force, what is your belief, what is your purpose, what is the motive behind it? Why do I want to do this? Is it because I want fame? Is it because I want the monetary benefit? But I believe whatever we pursue has to be bigger than ourselves. And definitely you have to set it up. Like for me personally, I still set up goals. This is what I want to achieve at the end of the year personally, for my life. This is what I want to expand on. But there are daily steps you need to take to achieve it. So implementation is a process, and more or less you have to be focused, you have to be persistent and persevere to the end. And that is important. And that is sometimes this is some of the challenges. You would observe that ability to be persistent and having that success mindset as well as being self-motivated.
Fantastic points there, Patrice. We have Anne-Marie joining us from Facebook, chiming in on the discussion. We must be selfless and give to gain. Point well taken on taking action. A lot of times we sit on what we know or where we are at, and we must be our sisters' keepers, our sisters' cheerleaders, and yes, continue to show up for yourself first, and when we learn, we share. So I think we can both say, Patrice, we agree with that comment.
Yes, we do.
All right. So, if you folks are just joining us on this session today or watching on the replay, we would have discussed Patrice's background with 20 years or over 20 years of this space in the construction industry and a lot of the challenges that you'd have experienced. So give us some insight on what you have gained that you did not expect when you started this journey.
What I've gained that I didn't expect was to build a company. As I shared my journey earlier, business was never on my agenda. My agenda was to become a civil engineer and, stay at Patries at the time, develop, and initially before that also study coastal engineering. Or what I would say I've gained, I've built a company, and it's not just a company for me, but we continue to impact over 30 families to date in terms of our staffing, being able to provide employment for those. The truth is, I would say that the plan wasn't perfect, but more or less it starts with determination, and that builds the difference. I would definitely say, I gained the business, I've gained self-development, etc., to continue the vision, more or less, and most importantly, the impact we are making in our space, in our space in terms of providing employment, etc.
And isn't that, I feel like that ties back into the theme gift again, right? Because having
Yes.
Being able to not just employ individuals, but then that in turn impacts their families. That
Yes.
is something that I would, you could share and expand on that in terms of your leadership role. How important is that for you?
I think leadership role is important. I mean, about 90%, let's say about 85% of our staff is females, some may be single parent, etc. And more or less through the journey, it's given that encouragement to them, to expand their knowledge, etc. And I know, like, for example, our janitorial services, one of my desires, and I still try to advocate for it as much as I could, is that I want to be able to see a custodian come into our organization, despite the challenges they may face, go back to school, educate themselves, and they grow within the organization from a custodian to a supervisor. So I want that impact, not just for the families, not just being able to that they could be happy or be able to have a salary when the month comes, but even in terms of their personal development, I definitely think that's something we try to continue to work with. And then even in addition to that, a few years ago, I founded Home for Me, which was the first home ownership event in the Caribbean to educate aspiring owners about the home ownership process in Trinidad and Tobago. And when I decided to embark on that journey is because what I've realized in the industry, a lot of people were being taken advantage of. They simply didn't understand the home ownership process. So I created this platform where it is we educate aspiring homeowners to understand the process so they become empowered. However, during that journey, I've realized some of the attendees didn't have the financial capacity to even save money, to even aspire to buy, purchase a piece of land. And then I pivot a bit, and at the last event I held, we decided to look at the 10 steps to home ownership. And the first step we looked at is empowering them in terms of having a success mindset, because I've realized those who are unable to achieve what they want to achieve, and in this case, in this scenario, in terms of gaining, is that home ownership, that home, that place to call home. They didn't have the mindset to pursue it. So, we begin to emphasize. And then I realized this has become a social issue, which is beyond my capacity. And we decided to take it into the school 1 year, which we would start back again this year. In terms of empowering the students, they need to have a success mindset. This means that you, regardless of where you come from, you have educational, you study your schoolwork, you get your subjects, you get a job, despite the challenges, so that you have that success mindset within the school and you take it. So I would say definitely, beside gaining in terms of the organization, being able to provide, impact the employees within the organization, I would have expanded further in terms of gaining that community that who wants to go into that home ownership journey.
Wow, super interesting, Patrice, because it sounds like when you initially had that home ownership event, you saw the need to pivot based on what the market and your attendees information that was shared. So that's some interesting insight. Even within your Give to Gain theme, it seems like you're following the same path in your entrepreneurship as well. So when it comes to we're talking about support and Give to Gain, especially as an entrepreneur, we must talk about associations, right? So you're a member of the Trinidad and Tobago Contractors Association. So I want to know, how has that been part of your network supporting your growth and advancement?
Sure. So being part of the Trinidad and Tobago Contractors Association, in the past I was part of AFET. Currently, I'm also part of CHAWI. It taught me something important. A lot of people join these associations for the networking benefit, which is good, as well as, what they could give more or less. But being exposed to it, and in most cases, I would have sat on the board of directors, you realize there's a necessity to pay it forward in these spaces, basically. From the beginning, I made a decision to volunteer my time, contribute to what I could, because, I wanted to make an impact in the industry and as a country. In order for us to really be impactful as a NGO in this case, it's important for us to have a united voice. And that is where the real value for me came from, being part of the association. What it has done in terms of my advancement is there are rooms, conversations, and I would say decision-making spaces that as an individual, as me by myself, I wouldn't have been able to access or influence on my own. But when I'm part of the collective association, we advocate together. Your voice carries weight. It's bigger from it. To me, in this case, it's bigger. It's a bigger part of it of my personal and professional growth, where you can assist or help in the implementation policy. So for me, it wasn't just about advancing myself or my leadership or the business, but more or less contributing to in this case, the construction industry as a whole. And once the industry builds, everybody benefits, because we would all understand the dynamics in terms of the construction industry, how it impacts, economical growth. And once that happens, the entire country benefits. So I look at it as more paying it forward rather than what I could gain more or less. And as I've said, being part of it gives me the opportunity to be part of these spaces.
Definitely important points, especially when we're living in a world so connected, and social media has proven that we're all better with communities. So we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to look at, I don't know if it's controversial or not, but women in the construction industry. Like, let's get some insight from Patries on that. Maybe she'll give us a secret. We don't know. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Straight Off the Bat, a show that helps you understand financial literacy and education. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you're doing so from Facebook, don't forget to subscribe to our page to continue seeing content that'll help you manage your money. I'm your host, Pauline Joseph, and today we are covering the topic International Women's Day Breaking Ground. We're joined by Patries Ramkaran. She is the visionary founder and managing director of Ramkaran Contracting Services Limited, a role she has held since establishing the company in 2005. With over 2 decades of experience in the construction industry, she has built a reputation for strategic leadership, technical excellence, and a commitment to delivering high-impact projects. So we're going to welcome back Patries. Again, if you are just joining us and you missed, the session earlier on today, not to worry. Everything will be on social media once this live has ended. So just before the break, we were discussing being a member of the Trinidad and Tobago Contractors Association. We want to have a discussion more specifically with the theme when it comes to women entering industries like construction. Within the space, it's fair to say that it's male dominated. So how important is it for mentorship and that collaboration and community when it comes to women entering an industry that may be male dominated? Can you give us some advice on that?
Women entering the industry, as I mentioned earlier, competence is very important. Not that you need to prove yourself because you're a female entering the industry, but as I said, when you are competent, you have the knowledge, etc., it builds your confidence, and definitely you are respected. You don't want to enter somewhere you don't have the competence. For example, they say square pegs and round holes. I think that's definitely important. Mentorship, collaboration, and community. It's very, very important. And this is a conversation in terms of we as women need to build women. A few times I would have experienced sometimes your own fellow professionals trying to not build you, but rather than work with you, etc. You're faced with that. And even now, I would say we have to continue to collaborate on a bigger scale. If we see a young woman entering the industry, it's important for us to support rather than allow our issues to manifest and show our insecurities. So that's important as it relates to women building women. And definitely collaboration is important. Your network is important as well. For example, for those who probably pursue their studies here locally, what would happen? Sometimes you may have a fellow classmate working in a particular ministry. You need some assistance on something. It's important to help where you can help each other. Definitely, I would say is important as it relates to mentorship. As I mentioned earlier, find a mentor, etc. The truth is, many of the challenges they face is something we would have already faced, etc. And through mentorship, it's not just to give the advice, but to give the perspective, because you want to avoid costly mistakes. You want to be able to move faster and grow with intention. And what we are doing, I've mentioned this briefly, the Contractors Association, this is the first year we are hosting a Women in Construction Networking and Leadership Forum. I'm champion the cause to this because I saw the need for women to be seen in the industry. And I've never saw anything locally, I'm not sure in the Caribbean, but in Trinidad and Tobago, where there's a forum specific for women leaders in the construction industry, in addition to those who are aspiring to be. So I think this is the start in terms of us paying it forward as it relates to mentorship. as it relates to collaboration, as it relates to community, because at these sort of events is where you would network, you may meet some fellow persons, and you can reach out to them and you could talk about that aspect of collaboration as well as, mentorship, etc. So, it's creating the opportunities for these things to happen for the women entering the industry and also for the women that already experienced in the industry to pay it forward.
Wow, sounds like some exclusive information. Thanks for sharing. We're just going to head over to the comments, and we have Anne-Marie, excited about women in construction. I wear one of those hats. I love that pun, Anne-Marie. I hope it's a hard hat for health and safety reasons. But she mentioned that you share the NGOs in Trinidad that supports mentorship, and she didn't really get the name. So if you could just mention that again. I know you mentioned it, but if you can repeat that, let us know.
All right, so for mentorship, there's AFET, which is the Association of Female Executives at Trinidad and Tobago. There's CHAWI, which I'm currently a director with too, which is the objective of empowering women, which is the Caribbean Women's Hours Network in Trinidad and Tobago. So, and in addition to that, there's also HERMAT. I saw they also have a mentorship program. Internationally, there's Sherry Blair Foundation, which is a NGO in UK. They provide mentorship for women, but there's an application process. You fill out the form, etc. You become selected. And there's also the Vital Voices Network out of Washington, D.C., which I'm also a fellow of. There are sometimes different programs created to women leaders, social entrepreneurs, etc. So more or less, you could check online and see what the international network is offering together with local networks as well.
Thanks again to Anne-Marie joining us from Facebook for that question. Definitely pieces of information that we all need as we are looking for support and collaboration to further ourselves in our professional and personal careers as well. So when it comes to the conversation where we're looking at International Women's Day, breaking ground, we must cover, what someone who's watching this, a young person, what would you say to that person from Trinidad and Tobago who wants to step into a space where they don't traditionally fit? Because yes, there are some social norms when it comes to women in the professional workspace as well as at home. So when it comes to pursuing something that may not be traditional, what advice would you give to that young woman in Trinidad and Tobago?
Sure. The advice I would give to that woman that want to enter into the non-traditional space, as mentioned earlier, it's important to know the reason why you want to do what you want to do. So, for example, you want to enter into the construction industry. Somebody's reason may be that, the monetary benefits, it's good. So, it's a good fit to enter into. But definitely, I think passion is important. You have to have a passion for what you are doing, because passion is what's going to drive you in terms of expanding in that field or in that industry or fitting in. And in addition to that, as I mentioned also earlier, it's important you have that passion, you have the vision, etc., so that you can enter. Competence is important. So it's important that you do what's necessary, educate yourself, build experiences, etc. And as I said, experience, I remember when I was working at Patries, my job was based in administration and oil and gas industry. And I remember what I used to do on Saturdays. I used to work with a contractor and a consultant just to get that on-field knowledge, on-site knowledge, so that while I'm working at that institution, I'm still building my experience on the sites, etc. So, in situations like that, you have to pivot and put it forward in the event that it have limitation. And I did not ask for a salary. I did not want any payment. More or less, I just wanted to learn and understand, etc. So it's important, as I mentioned before, the three things: the reason why you are doing it, be competent in terms of doing the necessary studies, etc., as well as having the passion to pursue it. And most additionally, we mentioned about mentorship. We mentioned about communities before. Sometimes to build that confidence, it's important to look for a mentor. Find somebody, go in the spaces that they may exist so that you can get that sort of mentoring to help you position you better into there. And sometimes you don't need to shrink to fit in. in these places, sometimes we go into that spaces to cause changes, you know. So that's my advice to somebody who wants to enter into the non-traditional space.
Once again, I was on mute. Sorry about that, everybody. Been doing this for so long and still do that. So thanks again to Patrice for sharing that. I just want to shout out to Leonie's Toussaint, who's joining us from Facebook. Would like to say thank you for repeating the list. You see, people think that we just repeating everything, but there are a lot of times folks are just joining us, and it's extremely important for us to continue sharing this information because this all ties back into financial literacy and education as we pursue our goals, may it be personal and professional. And we want to thanks again to Patries Ramkaran, who is the founder and managing director of Ramkaran Contracting Services Limited. Thanks again for joining us today and sharing her story as we discussed International Women's Day Breaking Ground. Once again, sign up to be notified for our live show via the links in the comments if you're watching this on LinkedIn, Facebook, or YouTube. I don't know where to point because it depends on where you're watching this. We have the links there so you could sign up for the live show. Always be sure to follow our pages across social media so you don't miss a single live show. And once again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you for the next show. Bye.